Sometimes a promise made to the dying can lead a person to a place they never imagined. Naomi Carter stood at the bottom of the marble steps outside the Grand Regency Hotel and looked up at the glowing windows above her. The building seemed to touch the night sky of Seoul, its golden lights reflecting against polished stone and expensive cars arriving one after another. Men in black suits and women in elegant gowns stepped onto the red carpet with the easy confidence of people who belonged there. Naomi did not feel like she belonged anywhere near this place. She tightened her grip on the old wooden box resting in her arms. The ribbon around it had faded long ago, and the edges had been worn smooth by time. Her mother had protected this box for more than 20 years and had never once allowed Naomi to open it. 3 weeks earlier, everything had changed. Her mother had been lying in a hospital bed in Brooklyn, the evening sunlight spilling softly through the curtains. The machines had been quiet. The room had smelled faintly of lavender tea. Eleanor Carter had reached for her daughter's hand and placed the wooden box into it. "Promise me something," she had whispered. Naomi had leaned closer. "Anything." Her mother's tired eyes had filled with emotion. "Take this to Seoul. Find Ethan Kong." Naomi had frowned. She had never heard that name before. Who is he? But her mother had only smiled gently. "You will understand when the time is right." A few hours later, she was gone. Since then, those words had followed Naomi everywhere. Find Ethan Kong. She had searched through old papers and family photographs until she discovered that Ethan Kong would be attending a memorial gathering for his late father at the Grand Regency Hotel. That single piece of information had brought her across an ocean. Now she stood outside one of the most luxurious places she had ever seen, wondering if she had made a mistake. Through the glass doors, she could see crystal chandeliers and people dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She looked down at her simple navy dress and sensible shoes. Nothing about her suggested that she belonged among the city's most powerful families. She could still walk away. She could return to her hotel room and catch the first flight back to New York in the morning. Nobody inside knew her name. Nobody was waiting for her. But then she remembered the way her mother had held the wooden box, as if it contained a piece of her heart. A promise was a promise. Naomi drew a long breath and climbed the steps. The doors opened, and warm light spilled across the marble floor. Soft piano music drifted from somewhere inside. She held the wooden box a little tighter and walked toward the grand ballroom, where hundreds of guests had gathered beneath sparkling chandeliers and white flowers. Somewhere inside that room was a man she had never met, and before the night ended, a forgotten act of kindness would change every life in that ballroom. Naomi stepped into the ballroom and immediately felt every difference between herself and the people around her. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above dozens of elegantly dressed guests, and soft piano music drifted through the room like a quiet river. Men in tailored suits stood beside tables decorated with white roses, and women in evening gowns spoke in low voices while servers carried silver trays through the crowd. At the far end of the room hung a large portrait of an older Korean man surrounded by candles and white flowers. Naomi guessed that this was Ethan Kang's father. She tightened her hold on the wooden box and slowly walked forward. Nobody seemed to recognize her. A few people glanced in her direction and then looked again, curious about the unfamiliar woman carrying something old and worn in a room filled with luxury. She tried to ignore the stares. All she needed to do was find Ethan Kong and give him the box. Then she could leave. She had almost reached the center of the ballroom when a gentle voice stopped her. "Excuse me." Naomi turned. A beautiful woman wearing an ivory evening gown stood only a few feet away. Diamonds glimmered around her neck, and her polite smile looked carefully practiced. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "I hope so," Naomi replied. "I came here looking for Ethan Kong." The woman's expression changed slightly. "You know Mr. Kong?" Naomi shook her head. "Not personally. I came from New York because my mother asked me to find him." She lifted the wooden box slightly. "I have something that belongs to his family." The woman studied her carefully. "My name is Victoria Hayes," she said. "I have known the Kong family for years." Her eyes moved from Naomi's face to the box in her hands, and then back again. "I do not believe we have met before." "No," Naomi answered softly. This is my first time in Seoul. A few nearby guests had started listening. One man lowered his glass and looked toward them. Another woman stopped in the middle of a conversation. Victoria folded her hands in front of her. I see. Then she asked the question that made the room seem suddenly colder. Who invited you tonight? Naomi hesitated. She had no answer that sounded important enough for this room. I was told this would be the best place to find Mr. Kong, she said honestly. Victoria's smile faded. This is a private memorial. The words were polite, but something underneath them carried doubt. Several more guests turned toward the conversation. Naomi could feel their attention settling on her shoulders. She looked down at the old wooden box and suddenly felt very far from home. Understand, she said quietly. I did not mean to interrupt anything. She offered a small, apologetic smile. I only wanted to keep a promise to my mother. Victoria looked at her for another moment and then asked, loud enough for others nearby to hear, and what makes you believe you belong at a family memorial when nobody here seems to know who you are? The piano continued softly in the background, but around them the ballroom had become completely silent. The question seemed to hang in the air long after Victoria had spoken it. Naomi felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. She looked around the ballroom and suddenly became aware of how different she appeared from everyone else in the room. The old wooden box in her arms seemed heavier than before. For a moment, she considered turning around and walking out. Maybe I do not belong here, she said softly. I only know that my mother wanted me to find Ethan Kong. Victoria's expression softened for an instant, but her uncertainty remained. This evening is private, she replied gently. Everyone here knew Mr. Kang's father personally. A few people nearby nodded. Naomi lowered her eyes. Then I am sorry, she said quietly. I never wanted to cause trouble. She carefully adjusted the ribbon on the old box and took a slow breath. I think I should leave. One of the guests offered her a sympathetic smile. Another looked away awkwardly. Nobody seemed cruel, but nobody stepped forward either. Naomi understood that feeling. She had spent much of her life being the person who did not quite belong in certain rooms. She had learned to leave gracefully when necessary. She turned toward the entrance. If she could not find Ethan Kong tonight, perhaps she would try again tomorrow. She had taken only a few steps when the ballroom doors slowly opened. The change in the room was immediate. Conversation stopped. Waiters paused where they stood. Several guests straightened in their chairs. Even Victoria turned toward the entrance. A tall man entered the ballroom wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. The soft light from the chandeliers reflected against his dark hair. A subtle tattoo disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. He carried himself with quiet confidence, and without speaking a single word, he seemed to command the attention of everyone in the room. Naomi had never seen him before, but she somehow knew who he was. Ethan Kong. Victoria smiled with relief. Mr. Kong, she began, stepping forward. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. But Ethan did not answer. His eyes had already moved past her. He was looking directly at Naomi. More specifically, he was looking at the old wooden box in her arms. He stopped walking entirely. The room became so silent that Naomi could hear the faint melody of the piano in the far corner. Ethan took one slow step forward, then another. He passed directly by Victoria without acknowledging her. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Naomi stood frozen in place. She could hear the sound of his shoes against the marble floor as he approached. Finally, he stopped only a few feet away from her. His eyes never left the box. There was surprise in his expression, followed by something deeper, something almost impossible to describe. He looked as though he had just seen a memory come to life. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he lifted his eyes to Naomi's face. His voice, when it finally came, was calm but filled with emotion. Where did you get that box? Naomi looked down at the wooden box, and then back at the man standing before her. Up close, Ethan Kong appeared younger than she had expected, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying memories for a very long time. It belonged to my mother, she said softly. Ethan's gaze never left the box. What was your mother's name? He asked. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Eleanor Carter, Naomi replied. For a moment, Ethan did not move. Then he repeated the name in a whisper, as though he had not heard it spoken in years. Eleanor Carter. He slowly lifted his eyes to hers. You are her daughter? Naomi nodded. She passed away 3 weeks ago. Before she died, she asked me to find you and bring this to you personally. A murmur spread through the room. Victoria looked from Naomi to Ethan with complete confusion. Ethan seemed not to hear any of it. He carefully extended his hands toward the box. May I? He asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for only a second before placing it into his hands. He accepted it with surprising gentleness, almost as if it were something sacred. His fingers touched the faded ribbon, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes. Then he slowly opened the box. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch and a small photograph whose edges had turned yellow with age. The instant Ethan saw them, he froze. He lifted the photograph with trembling fingers and stared at it. Surprise crossed his face, followed by disbelief and then something that looked very much like grief. He turned the photograph toward the light. I cannot believe this, he whispered. The room remained silent. Finally, he looked back at Naomi. Your mother kept these all these years? I did not even know they existed until she gave me the box, Naomi answered. Ethan, look down at the silver watch. This belonged to my father, he said softly. Another wave of whispers moved through the ballroom. Naomi blinked in surprise. Your father? He nodded slowly. More than 20 years ago, my father became seriously ill during a business trip to New York. He was alone in a hospital, far from home and surrounded by strangers. He held the photograph carefully. Your mother was the nurse who stayed with him every evening after her shift had ended. Naomi stared at him. She had never heard this story before. She brought him books, sat with him when he could not sleep, and spoke to him when he was afraid. Ethan's voice had grown quieter. She treated him like family when she had no reason to do so. He looked down at the photograph again. My father never forgot her kindness. Several guests lowered their eyes. Victoria stood completely still, her expression changing with every word. Ethan closed the wooden box and held it gently against his chest. Then he looked directly at Naomi, and for the first time, there was unmistakable gratitude in his eyes. I've spent half my life hearing stories about your mother, he said softly. And tonight, somehow, she has found her way back to our family. The words settled over the ballroom like a gentle wave. Nobody spoke. Ethan continued holding the wooden box against his chest, his eyes still fixed on Naomi. For a long moment, he seemed to be somewhere else entirely, standing in a memory that belonged to another time. Then a small smile appeared on his face. My father talked about your mother every year, he said softly. He would tell us that when he was frightened and alone in a hospital far from home, one person made him feel like he mattered. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She never told me any of this, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. That does not surprise me. My father always said that the kindest people rarely speak about the good they have done. Several guests lowered their eyes. Even the waiters seemed unwilling to move. The room had become a place of listening rather than celebration. Ethan carefully placed the photograph back inside the box. After returning to Korea, my father kept this picture in his study. Whenever life became difficult, he would look at it and remind himself that kindness still existed in the world. Naomi blinked back tears. All her life, she had known her mother as a quiet nurse who worked long hours and worried about everyone except herself. She had never imagined that a simple act of compassion had remained alive in another family for more than 20 years. Ethan looked toward the large portrait surrounded by white flowers. My father often said there were people in life we owed more than money or success could ever repay. Then he turned back to Naomi. Your mother was one of those people. He took a slow step closer to her. Miss Carter, on behalf of my father and my entire family, thank you for bringing this back to us tonight. To the astonishment of everyone in the room, he bowed his head slightly toward her. A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. Naomi stood frozen. Only a short time earlier, she had been preparing to leave through those doors, embarrassed and convinced she had come to the wrong place. Now, one of the most respected men in the city was thanking her in front of everyone. Ethan straightened and looked toward the center of the ballroom, where a long table had been prepared for the memorial dinner. Beside his own chair sat another setting that had remained empty throughout the evening. He looked back at Naomi. "There is something I would like to ask you." She swallowed nervously. "Of course." He extended his hand toward her. "Would you join me at my table tonight?" Naomi stared at him in confusion. "Me?" A warm smile touched his face. "That empty seat has always been reserved for someone my father hoped to thank one day." The room became perfectly still once again. Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. Several guests exchanged astonished glances. Naomi looked toward the empty chair and then back at Ethan. "I do not think I belong there," she said quietly. Ethan's expression softened. "Your mother earned that place many years ago." The words seemed to echo through the ballroom. Naomi felt tears gathering once more. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, she no longer felt like a stranger carrying an old box through a room full of unfamiliar faces. She felt as though a promise had finally led her exactly where she was meant to be. Naomi looked at Ethan's outstretched hand and then at the empty chair beside his at the center of the ballroom. It seemed impossible that only a few minutes earlier she had been standing near the entrance, wondering how quickly she could leave without embarrassing herself further. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and steady. Together they walked across the marble floor, while every eye in the room followed them. The silence that surrounded them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful, almost reverent. A waiter gently pulled out the empty chair, and Naomi sat down carefully. Ethan took his seat beside her and placed the wooden box near the portrait of his father that decorated the center of the table. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan looked toward the portrait and smiled softly. "My father would have been very happy tonight," he said. Naomi followed his gaze. The older man's face seemed kind and familiar somehow, even though she had never seen him before. "I wish my mother could have seen this," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I think she can." The simple answer brought tears to her eyes again. Before she could respond, she noticed movement beside the table. Victoria stood there, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The confidence she had carried earlier had disappeared. She looked nervous. "Miss Carter," she said softly. Naomi looked up. "May I speak with you?" Ethan remained silent, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the two women. Victoria took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." Several nearby guests lowered their voices and listened. "When you arrived tonight, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed you did not belong here because I had never seen you before." She looked down for a moment. "I made you feel unwelcome in a place where you should have been honored from the very beginning." Naomi listened quietly. Victoria's eyes glistened with emotion. "I'm deeply sorry." For a moment, Naomi remembered how alone she had felt near the entrance, holding her mother's wooden box while strangers watched her. Then she remembered something her mother often said after difficult days at the hospital. "Every person deserves grace because none of us knows the whole story." A gentle smile appeared on Naomi's face. "My mother believed people could learn from their mistakes," she said softly. Victoria looked at her hopefully. "I would like to believe that too." Naomi slowly extended her hand. "Then I accept your apology." Relief washed over Victoria's face. She carefully shook Naomi's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Around them, several guests smiled. Ethan looked toward his father's portrait again and released a slow breath, as though another piece of the evening had fallen perfectly into place. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, Naomi no longer felt like someone standing outside a closed door. She felt welcomed. She felt seen. And somewhere deep inside, the grief she had carried since losing her mother seemed just a little lighter. As dinner continued, the atmosphere in the ballroom slowly changed. The tension that had filled the room earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by warmth and quiet reflection. Guests who had once watched Naomi with curiosity now approached her table one by one. An elderly businessman told her that he remembered hearing Ethan's father speak about an American nurse who changed his outlook on life. A woman in a silver gown said she had never seen Ethan speak so openly during a family gathering. Every conversation revealed another small piece of story Naomi had never known existed. It felt as though she were discovering an entire chapter of her mother's life that had been hidden in plain sight. Ethan listened to the conversations with a thoughtful expression. Every now and then he glanced at the old wooden box resting beside him, still unable to believe that it had returned to his family after so many years. Finally, he rose from his chair and gently tapped his glass with a spoon. The soft sound carried through the ballroom. One by one, conversations faded until the room became silent once again. Ethan looked toward the portrait of his father and then back at the guests. "Tonight we gathered to remember my father," he said calmly. "But I believe he would want us to remember something much greater than success or influence." He paused for a moment. "He would want us to remember kindness." The room remained perfectly still. More than 20 years ago, my father was a stranger in a hospital thousands of miles from home. He was frightened and alone. Then he met a nurse named Eleanor Carter. Naomi lowered her eyes as emotion filled her chest once again. She expected nothing in return. She simply believed that every person deserved dignity and compassion. Several guests nodded quietly. Ethan's voice softened. "My father often said that one act of kindness can change an entire life. Tonight, because of her daughter, we are all being reminded of that truth." He turned toward Naomi and smiled gently. "Miss Carter, thank you for carrying your mother's promise across an ocean." A wave of gentle applause filled the ballroom. Naomi blinked quickly and smiled through her tears. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small cream-colored envelope. The paper looked old, and its edges had turned slightly yellow with time. He held it carefully in his hand. "There is one more thing," he said softly. "Many years ago, my father gave this letter to me. He told me that if I ever had the privilege of meeting Eleanor Carter or anyone from her family again, I should place it in their hands." The room became silent once more. Ethan extended the envelope toward her. Naomi accepted it carefully, her fingers trembling. She opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was neat and elegant. At the bottom of the page was the signature of Ethan's father. As she began reading the words silently, tears immediately filled her eyes. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness matters more than status, and that the most valuable people in life are often the ones the world overlooks. If this letter ever reaches your family, please know that you will always have a place among ours." Naomi pressed the letter gently against her heart, and, for the first time since losing her mother, she felt something. Other than grief, she felt peace. Naomi held the letter against her heart long after the applause had faded. The paper felt delicate in her hands, yet the words written on it seemed heavier than anything she had carried across the ocean. Around her, the ballroom glowed beneath the chandeliers, but for a few moments, she hardly noticed anything else. She thought about her mother sitting beside hospital beds late at night, comforting strangers and returning home exhausted without ever speaking about the lives she had touched. Her mother had never considered herself extraordinary. She had simply believed that kindness was something people owed one another. Ethan slowly sat beside her again. He looked at the old letter and smiled gently. "My father wrote that after he returned to Korea, he said, he wanted to thank your mother properly, but life moved quickly and they never saw each other again." Naomi carefully folded the paper and slipped it back into its envelope. "I wish she could read it," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "So do I." They sat quietly for a while. Then he looked toward his father's portrait. "There is something I have never told anyone outside my family." Naomi turned toward him. "What is it?" He rested one hand on the wooden box. "My father said your mother changed him." She looked surprised. "Changed him?" Ethan smiled softly. "Before that trip to New York, he cared mostly about work and success. After meeting your mother, he became more patient and more generous. He started supporting hospitals and charities because he never forgot the kindness she showed him." Naomi stared at him. "You mean she influenced all of that?" He nodded. "More than she ever knew." Tears returned to her eyes. The idea that one simple act of compassion could reach across decades and affect so many lives felt almost impossible to understand. Around them, Guests had resumed their conversations, but their voices were softer now, as though everyone had been reminded of someone they once owed gratitude to. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "I think your mother left you more than a promise," he said. "I think she wanted you to know that her kindness mattered." Naomi lowered, her eyes to the envelope in her hands. Since losing her mother, she had carried grief like a heavy stone inside her chest. Now another feeling had appeared beside it. Prejudice. Not pride in herself, but in the woman who had raised her. She smiled through her tears. She would probably tell us she was only doing her job. Ethan laughed quietly, and my father would spend an hour disagreeing with her. They both smiled. Then they looked once more toward the portrait surrounded by white flowers. In the warm light of the ballroom, it felt as though two people who had never met again had somehow reunited their families one final time. And for the first time that evening, Naomi no longer felt that she had come to deliver a box. She felt that she had come home to a story that had been waiting for her all along. The evening slowly began to fade, and one by one the guests prepared to leave the ballroom. The candles surrounding the portrait burned lower, and the musicians quietly placed their instruments back into their cases. Yet Naomi remained seated for a few moments, the old letter resting gently in her hands. She looked around the room that had frightened her only a few hours earlier. It no longer felt like a place where she did not belong. It felt like the final chapter of a promise that had traveled across an ocean and found its destination. Ethan stood near his father's portrait, speaking softly with one of the hotel staff members. When he noticed Naomi watching him, he walked back to the table and smiled. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I think I am." Together, they walked toward the portrait surrounded by white flowers. The wooden box and silver watch rested nearby, no longer hidden, but finally returned to the family that had waited so many years to see them again. Ethan looked at the photograph inside the box and released a quiet breath. "My father used to say that some people leave fingerprints on our lives without ever realizing it." He looked at Naomi. "Your mother was one of those people." Naomi smiled gently. She would have laughed if she heard that. Ethan smiled too. Then she and my father would have spent the whole evening arguing about who deserved the credit. They both laughed softly. The sound seemed to lighten the room even more. After a moment, Naomi looked at the portrait. "I spent most of my life thinking my mother was ordinary," she said quietly. "Now I realize she was extraordinary in ways I never understood." Ethan nodded. The people who change lives rarely know they are doing it. The words settled between them like a final gift. Outside the ballroom windows, the lights of Seoul sparkled against the dark sky. A car waited near the entrance to take Naomi back to her hotel. Neither of them seemed eager to end the evening. "I came here because I thought I was delivering something," Naomi said softly, looking at the letter in her hands. "But I think I was really here to receive something instead." Ethan looked at her curiously. "What did you receive?" She smiled through tears that no longer felt heavy. "The chance to know who my mother truly was." Ethan's expression softened. "Then I think your journey was worth every mile." A gentle breeze drifted through the open doors leading to the garden. Ethan reached into his pocket and handed her a small card. "If you ever return to Seoul, I hope you will call." Naomi accepted it and smiled. "I would like that." The driver opened the car door for her. Before stepping inside, she turned one last time toward Ethan and the glowing entrance of the hotel. "Thank you for remembering my mother," she said. Ethan shook his head gently. "No, Miss Carter. Thank you for reminding all of us what kindness looks like." Naomi smiled and entered the car. As it slowly pulled away from the hotel, she looked through the window and saw Ethan still standing beneath the warm lights, one hand resting over the old wooden box. She raised her hand in farewell, and he did the same. Then the city carried her into the night. Somewhere between New York and Seoul, between an old promise and a forgotten act of compassion, two families had found each other again. And on that quiet evening, everyone who witnessed it remembered something simple and true. Dignity does not arrive with wealth or status. Sometimes it walks into a room carrying an old wooden box and leaves behind a legacy that changes every heart it touches.